In Minnesota, protests continued more than a week after an ICE agent shot and killed Renee Good. This as the Justice Department investigates Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. Ian Lee has the latest.
Not everybody deserves to be here.
In Minneapolis on Saturday, anti-ICE protesters faced off against those who support the agency. The latest clashes in a city on edge.
Trump's Department of Justice just went completely silent on case that could blow open questions about federal accountability, and what's happening behind that silence is absolutely devastating. Renee Good was killed during ICE raid in Minnesota, shot while protesting detention of her neighbor, and DOJ under Pam Bondi won't investigate what happened, won't open criminal inquiry, won't provide Minnesota state prosecutors with evidence they need to determine if charges should be brought. Instead, administration is claiming federal agent involved has immunity from prosecution, that he can't be touched by state authorities, that no investigation can proceed because he was acting in official capacity. J.D. Vance went on television making sweeping claims about absolute immunity for federal officers, and legal experts are calling that complete misrepresentation of what law actually says. But real quick, if you want to stay ahead of the headlines, please subscribe, because you might think you are, but aren't. Your subscription actually matters here. That's why we built Patrick Smith Show, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. All right, let's get into what's actually happening, because this case raises fundamental questions about whether federal agents can be held accountable when things go catastrophically wrong. ICE conducted immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota. Renee Good came out to protest what was happening to people in her community. She wasn't armed. She was exercising First Amendment rights. And during that protest, she was shot and killed. Now her wife, Becca Good, is left without answers, without justice, without any clear path to accountability because DOJ is refusing to investigate. Share this video with everyone you know, because think about what that silence means. When federal agent is involved in shooting that kills American citizen, there should be immediate investigation, should be review of what happened, should be determination of whether force was justified or whether crimes were committed. That's basic accountability in any law enforcement context. But DOJ isn't doing any of that. Won't open inquiry, won't examine evidence, won't make any determination about whether agents' actions were lawful. And they're blocking Minnesota from investigating too. State prosecutors led by Keith Ellison want to examine what happened, want to determine if state charges are appropriate, but they can't get access to evidence they need. DOJ won't provide bullet casings for forensic analysis, won't share witness statements collected at scene, won't give Minnesota access to materials that would normally be shared between law enforcement agencies investigating potential crime. Prosecutors are essentially having to crowdsource their investigation, asking public for video evidence and witness accounts because federal government won't cooperate. Here's where legal complexity comes in. J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller are claiming federal agent has absolute immunity from prosecution, saying he can't be charged by state authorities no matter what happened because he was operating as federal officer. But legal experts say that's not accurate representation of law. In criminal context, there is no absolute immunity doctrine that shields federal agents from state prosecution for crimes committed within that state's borders. Think about what Vance is actually doing. He's conflating different legal concepts to create impression that federal officers are completely above law. There are immunity doctrines in civil context. There's something called Bivens doctrine that makes it very difficult to sue federal agents for constitutional violations. But criminal prosecution is a different question. States have jurisdiction over crimes committed within their borders, even when person who committed crime is federal employee. The Bivens issue matters for civil accountability. Renee Good's family and their lawyers could try to bring wrongful death lawsuit against agent and against federal government. But Supreme Court has made that incredibly difficult through series of rulings that essentially gutted Bivens protections. Court has said unless Congress specifically authorized private lawsuits against particular type of federal entity, those lawsuits get dismissed based on immunity. Here's how that works in practice. If Congress never made laws saying you can sue ICE agents for civil rights violations, courts can dismiss lawsuit claiming there's no cause of action. That's different from criminal immunity. That's civil liability question. but Vance is using that civil doctrine to claim criminal immunity that doesn't actually exist. He's misrepresenting law to protect agent from any accountability whatsoever. And there's exception to attorney-client privilege and to these immunity doctrines. If communications involve planning future crimes, privilege gets pierced. If agents' actions fall outside scope of legitimate federal authority, immunity doesn't apply. So if what happened in Minnesota was criminal act rather than lawful use of force, immunity claims fall apart. That's why investigation is so important. That's why DOJ's refusal to investigate is so problematic. Think about what questions need answering. Was shooting justified under any reasonable use of force standard? Did agent have legitimate reason to believe deadly force was necessary? Was Renee Good posing actual threat that warranted lethal response? Those are basic questions that investigation would address. But without investigation, without access to evidence, without any accountability process, those questions never get answered. Minnesota prosecutors are trying to reconstruct what happened without DOJ cooperation. Fortunately, there's video from scene. Bystanders recorded the raid. New York Times did detailed analysis. CNN created forensic reconstruction. So prosecutors will eventually have enough information to make charging decision. But they shouldn't have to work around federal obstruction to investigate potential crime that occurred in their jurisdiction. Protests are mounting across Minnesota and beyond. People demanding answers about what happened. Demanding DOJ investigate instead of covering up. Demanding accountability for Renee Good's death. And they're connecting this case to broader concerns about how ICE and Border Patrol operate under Trump administration, about whether these agencies have become unaccountable forces that operate outside normal law enforcement constraints. And there's pattern here that's deeply concerning. Trump administration has constructed ICE and Border Patrol as what some are calling militarized paramilitary operations. They've eliminated fitness requirements that used to screen applicants. They've lowered training standards. They're deploying National Guard personnel and others who aren't trained in law enforcement to conduct immigration operations. And when things go wrong, when force gets used, when people get hurt or killed, there's no accountability mechanism. Think about what that creates. Federal agents operating in American communities who know they won't face consequences if something goes catastrophically wrong, who understand administration will protect them from investigation or prosecution, who see themselves as answering only to president rather than to law or constitution. That's not professional law enforcement. That's something much more dangerous. Congressional Democrats are preparing investigations into this. They want hearings on Homeland Security under Kristi Noem, want to examine ICE operations and training and use of force policies. Renee Good's case will be central to those investigations. Becca Good will likely testify about losing her wife and about being denied answers or accountability. Witnesses who saw what happened will share their accounts. Public will hear directly about how federal operation resulted in American citizens' death and how administration responded with silence and obstruction. And plaintiff's bar is getting involved too. Lawyers representing Renee Good's family will try to bring civil claims, wrongful death, constitutional violations, claims against agent who shot her, and against ICE for inadequate training and supervision. But those civil cases face enormous obstacles because of how Supreme Court has gutted Bivens protections. Maybe that criminal prosecution is only real avenue for accountability, and DOJ is blocking that. Make sure you're subscribed to Patrick Smith Show, because here's what makes this situation so legally complex and politically explosive. Multiple paths to accountability and all of them being obstructed. Criminal prosecution blocked by DOJ refusing to investigate and claiming immunity. Civil litigation blocked by Supreme Court rulings making it nearly impossible to sue federal officers. Congressional oversight limited because Republicans control both chambers and won't hold Trump accountable. Every avenue gets shut down by system designed to protect federal agents from consequences. Share this with everyone, because what happens if Minnesota decides to charge agent despite DOJ claims of immunity? Constitutional crisis. Federal government saying state has no jurisdiction. Minnesota asserting its sovereignty to prosecute crimes within its borders. Courts having to decide whether federal agents really are immune from state prosecution when they kill people during federal operations. That's unprecedented legal territory that could reshape relationship between federal and state authority. Think about historical precedents here. There have been cases where federal officers faced state prosecution. There have been cases where immunity claims got rejected, but never quite like this, where administration is preemptively claiming absolute immunity and refusing all cooperation with state investigation. That's new level of federal overreach, new assertion that federal employees operate completely above state law. And timing matters. This happened during Trump's deportation operations, during period when ICE is conducting raids across country, when administration is deploying these forces into communities in ways that create confrontations with protesters and residents, when use of force incidents are reportedly increasing because agents are undertrained and operating in hostile environments. Renee Good's death isn't isolated incident. It's example of what happens when you militarize immigration enforcement and remove accountability. Minnesota prosecutors are asking for public help because they can't get cooperation from federal government. That's extraordinary. That's state law enforcement having to work around obstruction from DOJ to investigate potential crime. Shows how serious administration is about preventing any accountability for what happened, about protecting agent from consequences regardless of whether shooting was justified. Make sure you're subscribed because Becca Good deserves answers, deserves to know what happened to her wife, deserves some form of justice or accountability. And right now, administration is denying her all of that, saying there will be no investigation, no charges, no civil liability, no acknowledgement that anything wrong occurred. Just silence and immunity claims and obstruction of state prosecutors who want to examine evidence. Bottom line is this: Trump's DOJ went completely dark on case involving death of Renee Good during ICE operation in Minnesota. Won't investigate. Won't cooperate with Minnesota prosecutors who want to examine what happened. Instead, claiming federal agent has immunity from prosecution. J.D. Vance making sweeping statements about absolute immunity that legal experts say misrepresent what law actually provides. No such immunity exists in criminal context for federal agents who commit crimes during official duties. Minnesota trying to investigate but can't access evidence from DOJ, having to crowdsource information from public, relying on video and witness statements rather than getting cooperation federal government should provide. Eventually, we'll have enough to make charging decision about whether agent should face state prosecution, but working around federal obstruction rather than with federal cooperation. Biven's doctrine makes civil accountability nearly impossible. Supreme Court gutted protections for suing federal officers, so criminal prosecution may be only real avenue for justice. And DOJ is blocking that avenue while claiming immunity that doesn't legally exist in this context. Every path to accountability gets obstructed. Protests mounting as people demand answers, demand investigation, demand some form of justice for Renee Good and her family. Democrats preparing congressional investigations. Plaintiffs' lawyers preparing civil claims despite obstacles. Questions about whether federal agents have become unaccountable force operating above law. This story continues developing. Stay tuned.